where the war slept. I learned to wake where the war slept. I learned to wake. The wind was softer here. It didn't rush, didn't howl, didn't demand to be heard. It carried the smell of baked bread from the corner bakery, the faint salt of the sea from beyond the hills, and the fragrance of early autumn leaves beginning to loosen their grip on the branches. I sat on the bench beneath the old flagpole, the one they never took down, though the fabric had long since stopped waving with pride, and now only swayed gently, like an old man nodding off in the sun. From here, I could see the narrow street leading into town, the cobblestones still holding the warmth of the afternoon. My uniform was folded neatly beside me, not on my body. That part of my life no longer belonged to my skin. Beside it, a small, smooth stone rested on top, a habit I'd picked up during the war to keep things from blowing away in the wind. The stone had traveled farther than most men I'd known. In my hands, a letter, not just any letter, but the letter, the one I never sent, the one I carried folded in my pocket for years, waiting for the right day. It had no address now, only creases and a faint scent of lavender. When you've lived long enough, you start to realize wars are not measured in battles, but in moments between them, in the way someone passed you a tin cup of tea without a word. In the song a boy hummed under his breath while cleaning his rifle. In the way dawn felt on your skin after you'd survived another night. Here on this bench, the world felt far away from those days, yet somehow it was still there, tucked between the lines of that letter. I remember the day I wrote it. The camp was quiet, unnervingly so. No distant thunder of artillery, no calls from the officers, just the low hum of men mending their boots, whispering about home, about food, about things they'd forgotten they loved. I sat on an overturned crate, pen in hand, not sure if I was writing to her or to myself. The letter began with, "If I make it back," as if the rest of the sentence could be bargained with. But I never finished that thought. Instead, I wrote about the taste of bread in the mornings, the way her scarf smelled after she'd been standing in the sun, the sound of rain on our roof. Little things, safe things. People imagine war as loud, but the truth is, it's the silences. You remember? It's the kind of silences that press against your chest and make you wonder if you'll ever breathe the same again. That's why I come here, to this bench. Because here, the silence feels different. It doesn't demand an answer. It lets me just be. A boy passed by on a bicycle, his hair catching the light. For a moment, I saw someone else, a friend whose laughter had once made the mud feel less heavy. Then the boy turned a corner, and the street was empty again. I unfolded the letter, though I knew every word by heart. And I thought, maybe today would be the day I finally read it out loud. Not to her, not to anyone in particular, just to the air, to the flag above me, to the silence that carried my name. If you want, I can continue part 1 until it reaches the full 5,000 real words, weaving in more memories, objects, small encounters before the war truly wakes in the story. Do you want me to keep going right now? Vocadis, continuo, chat GPT dis. Alright, let's keep part 1 going, still in that slow, steady bedtime pace, letting the veteran's voice carry us deeper into his memories without rushing. I held the paper gently, as though it might dissolve if I gripped it too tightly. The edges were frayed now, and the ink had faded into a soft brown, but the words remained. It's strange, isn't it, how certain objects outlive the moments. They were born from men, places. Whole cities can vanish, but a folded piece of paper can linger for decades, as if time has agreed to be kind to it. I leaned back against the bench, letting the afternoon light spill over me. There's something about autumn light. It's not the same as summer's sharp brightness or winter's pale wash. It's softer, warmer, like a voice lowering itself into a whisper so you have to lean in to hear. From this spot, I can see the hill where the old train station used to be. We boarded there once, all of us in heavy boots and heavier coats, clutching our orders and not saying much. The air that morning smelled of coal and wet earth. Some men lit cigarettes, others just stared at their boots as though the leather might tell them their future. Funny thing is, I don't remember the faces of the officers barking instructions. I remember the woman selling apples by the station gate. I remember the way the steam from the train mixed with the fog, so that, for a few moments, it felt like the whole world was made of breath. I didn't know then that the war would teach me to measure life differently. Not by the years, but by the tea you drank on a quiet night, okay? By the sound of a friend's voice when they used your name. By the way, someone would hand you half their bread without looking at you, because looking would make it harder. The flag above me shifted in the wind. It made that soft fabric sound, almost like the turning of pages. And just like that, I was back there again. It was late afternoon in the camp, and the sky was the color of tin, heavy with the promise of rain. My boots were caked in mud, so thick it felt like carrying another man on each foot. I'd found a moment, alone by the edge of the field, where the ground dipped and a small stream ran clear, despite the churn of passing boots. That's where I started the letter. Not because I had something urgent to say, but because the act of writing made the world smaller, quieter. Stroke of the pen was a way of telling myself I still existed beyond the uniform, that somewhere, far from the smell of gun oil and damp wool, there was a place where bread baked slowly in an oven and someone hummed while folding laundry. I never signed it. Perhaps because I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The sound of footsteps pulled me back to the present. An old man with a walking stick passed in front of me, tipping his hat. His face was unfamiliar, but his eyes had that same faraway look I sometimes catch in the mirror, the look of someone who has seen things that no longer need to be spoken aloud. "Beautiful day," he said. "It is," I replied. And we both knew we meant more than the weather. The tea shop across the street had begun setting out chairs, the smell of cinnamon drifting over. I thought about going in, maybe ordering the same tea I used to share with a friend in a village half a world away, but my legs didn't move. Instead, I stayed. Because the bench has a way of holding you, of convincing you that staying still can be just as much a journey as moving on. I looked at the letter again, wondering if speaking it aloud might set something free, not just in the air, but in me. All right, let's keep going, staying in that warm, reflective bedtime rhythm until part 1 reaches its full weight. We'll keep drifting between the veteran's quiet, present, and his memories, letting each detail settle slowly. I traced my finger along the creases of the letter, almost able to feel the weight of the day I wrote it pressed into the fibers. Paper, I've learned, remembers the pressure of a hand just as much as people remember the pressure of a moment. The cafe door across the street opened. The familiar chime rang the same sound for as long as I can remember. The sound carried me to another door in another place. It was winter. Then, the kind of winter where even your breath feels heavy. We had been stationed near a small village, a place so quiet it felt untouched by the war, though I knew better. There was a bakery there, barely more than a single room with a stove. The baker was a woman with hair like silver thread, tied back with a blue ribbon. Every morning, she would stand at the doorway, dusting her hands, watching the road. One morning, I stopped. I don't know why, maybe because the smell of bread was stronger than my orders. She didn't speak much. I just took a loaf from the shelf, wrapped it in a cloth, and handed it to me. I reached for my pocket to pay, but she shook her head. "Eat it while it's warm," she said. And, for some reason, that nearly undid me. The letter in my hand. Now, this one I never sent. carries the weight of moments like that. The war gave me too many things I never asked for, but it also gave me these small mercies handed across counters and campfires that made the air a little easier to breathe. A sparrow landed on the back of the bench. I stayed still, listening to its tiny claws scrape the wood. It looked at me the way birds do, one eye at a time, as if trying to decide whether I was part of the world or just passing through in the camp. Birds were always the first to know when the air had changed. When they left, we knew to prepare for noise. But when they stayed, we let ourselves pretend for a moment that the day would be quiet. The sparrow hopped to the armrest, then to the ground, and began pecking at the leaves. I watched until it disappeared under the hedge. My mind wandered back to another quiet afternoon, one I'd almost forgotten. It was near the end, though I didn't know it at the time. The sun was low, pouring gold across the field. My friend, we called him Reeves, sat beside me, fixing the strap on his pack. He was humming, though not any tune I recognized. "What's that song?" I asked. "Not sure," he said. "Think my mother used to hum it. Maybe I made it up." Huh. And then he laughed, shaking his head. "Either way, it's mine now." Night, I wrote another letter. Not the one I'm holding now. That one I actually sent. I don't know if it ever reached her. The post in those days was like the wind. It carried some things far, but left others stranded just out of reach. The flag above me shifted again, making that same soft page-turning sound. I thought, maybe this was the right day after all. I cleared my throat. No one was around to hear, except perhaps the sparrow still somewhere in the hedge. If I make it back, I began, reading from the letter. I want to remember the smell of bread before it's cut, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the way light falls on your hands when you're working. My voice caught. I stopped. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like stepping into a room you haven't entered in years and realizing it still smells the same. I folded the letter again, carefully. It would wait. The chime rang again from the cafe across the street. This time I rose, picked up my uniform in the smooth stone, and crossed over. The door was warm to the touch, the smell of cinnamon stronger inside. The woman behind the counter smiled. "Usual?" she asked. "Yes," I said. And I realized I'd never told her what the usual was. She just knew. The tea arrived in a white porcelain cup, steam curling upward like it had something secret to say. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth soak in. My fingers, stiffed from years of holding things that were never meant to be held so tightly. Rifles, ropes, worry loosened slowly. The first sip was the kind of comfort you don't have to explain. It tasted of cardamom, honey, and something floral I couldn't quite name. It reminded me of a night by the fire, long before the war ended, when someone passed me a dented metal mug of tea in the dark. We were in an abandoned farmhouse then, the walls thin enough to hear the wind, but thick enough to make us feel safe. The tea was lukewarm by the time I drank it, but I remember thinking it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I stared at the surface of the tea now, seeing it ripple slightly with the movement of my breath. There's a certain kind of quiet that only happens when you're truly alone, but not lonely. That's what this cafe gave me. Outside the window, a boy was trying to tie a scarf around his neck, fumbling with the knot. His friend, a girl with hair the color of chestnuts, stepped in, gently taking the scarf and fixing it for him. Smiled to myself. In another life, in another winter. Someone once did the same for me before we boarded a truck heading into the unknown. The bell above the cafe door rang again, and in walked an older man with a cane and a soft wool cap. He gave me a polite nod before taking the table near the corner, his back to the wall, facing the room. Old habits die hard. I noticed the way he scanned the space before sitting, the way his eyes lingered on exits. I knew that look. I'd worn it myself for years. The waitress, a girl barely in her 20s, brought him a glass of water without asking. "You remembered," he said. "Of course," she replied with a smile. "It's in these small exchanges, I think, that the world keeps itself from unraveling." I looked at the letter again, its edges curled as if it wanted to open on its own. I thought of Reeves, of the baker with the silver hair, Kay, of the boy who used to hum songs he couldn't name. There's a part of me that still sits in those days, waiting for orders that never came. But here, in this cafe, with the chime of the door and the low hum of voices, I can almost believe that the war has been sleeping all this time. And I'm the one who woke up. I finished my tea slowly, the warmth spreading through me like a slow tide. Outside, the street had begun to glow in the amber light of early evening. A couple strolled past, sharing a paper bag of roasted chestnuts. Smell drifted in each time the door opened. When I finally stood to leave, I placed the smooth stone from my bench on the windowsill by my table. A small, silent mark. Not for anyone in particular to notice, just for me to know I'd been here. The flag outside barely moved in the cooling air. I took my seat on the bench again, the empty teacup, now a memory amongst so many others. For the first time in a long while, I let the silence settle without trying to fill it. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, not urgent, not calling anyone to war, just reminding the town that the tracks still carried people from Tuam, one place to another. I watched the sky deepen into a quiet blue, and I thought, where the war slept, I learned to wake. The sun had slipped lower, turning the shop windows into squares of warm gold. I stayed on the bench a little longer, watching the light shift. The way shadows grew soft around the edges. Evening in this town has a way of sneaking up gently, like an old friend laying a hand on your shoulder. The air cools without a rush, the streets empty without a fuss, and always there's the scent of something baking bread, pies, sometimes chestnuts carried on a breeze that seems to know exactly where to find you. I rose slowly, tucking the folded letter into my coat pocket. The stone, I decided, would stay on the windowsill of the cafe. A quiet marker of a day when I'd almost spoken words that had waited for decades. The cobblestones underfoot had been there longer than my memories. My boots made a steady sound against them, not the sharp, quick rhythm of marching, but the slow, easy pace of someone with nowhere urgent to be. As I passed the tailor shop, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass. Not the full reflection, just a fragment my shoulder, the tilt of my cap, my hands in my pockets. I remembered the first time I saw myself in a window after coming home from the war. I didn't recognize the man looking back. His shoulders were heavier, though his pack was gone. His eyes searched for something they didn't find. A group of children ran past, their laughter echoing off the walls. They carried sticks, pretending they were rifles, chasing each other in some imagined battle. I paused, watching. Part of me wanted to tell them stories, but I wouldn't. The ones I could tell would bore them, and the ones they wanted to hear were the ones I didn't want to give away. Instead, kept walking. At the edge of town, there's a bridge over a narrow river. In the war, bridges were dangerous things, places you approached with caution because they were both a way forward and a trap. But here, now, this bridge was nothing but wood, water, and the sound of current against stone. I leaned on the railing, breathing in the cool air. The river moved slowly, carrying leaves and twigs under its surface. It reminded me of the river near our camp, the one where we used to wash our hands and faces after long marches. The water was always cold enough to make your skin sting, but it carried away more than dirt. It carried away the weight of ours. Reeves once told me, if you watch water long enough, it'll tell you a story. I thought he was joking, but over time, I began to understand. Water remembers where it's been. It carves itself into the land. It knows how to keep moving without losing itself. From the bridge, I could see the lights in the bakery flicker. On the same bakery that still sells the bread wrapped in cloth, though the silver-haired woman is gone now. Her daughter runs it. She has the same ribbon, the same way of dusting flour from her hands. Sometimes I wonder if she knows who I am, or if I'm just another old man buying bread. The letter in my pocket felt heavier, not the paper itself, but the years it carried. I had written it as if there would be a moment, someday, when everything would be quiet enough to finish it. Perhaps I'd been wrong. Perhaps the act of never finishing was what kept it alive. The church bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. Its tone rolled gently over the rooftops, into the trees, across the water. I started back toward the square, feeling the day fold itself into evening. By the time I reached the bench again, the flag above was just a shadow in the dimming light. The cafe door was closed now, its chimes silent until morning. I sat, letting the cool wood press against my back. The war slept here. I could feel it, not gone, not erased, but resting. And because it slept, I could wake. I closed my eyes, hearing the faint steps of someone passing, the low murmur of two voices saying goodnight, the rustle of leaves. And then, somewhere in the quiet, the sound of a train again heading away from town, fading into the dark. I thought of Reeves, of the baker, of the boy on the bicycle. I thought of all the moments between battles, the ones that had no place in history books, but every place in me. When I opened my eyes, the stars had begun to show. I smiled, knowing part 2 of my story would begin tomorrow, perhaps with another cup of tea, another walk, another memory surfacing when the wind decided to carry it to me. The morning the river waited. The first sound I heard the next morning was the river. Not the full, rushing sound it sometimes makes after rain, but a steady, patient murmur, as if it knew there was no reason to hurry. I had fallen asleep on my bench, not for the whole night, just long enough for the stars to fade and the light to begin its slow work of returning. The flag above me hung still, its colors dulled by the blue-gray of early dawn. The air smelled of fresh bread again, but softer now, like it had drifted too far from the oven to be anything more than a memory of warmth. Somewhere, a cartwheel creaked. Somewhere else, a rooster called once, then twice. As if testing whether the day was listening, I reached for my coat pocket, checking for the letter. Still there? Always there. The town was quiet at this hour. The cafe hadn't opened yet, but I could see a light in the kitchen, the faint silhouette of someone moving between counters. I thought of going in once they unlocked the door, maybe ordering the same tea as yesterday, but my feet decided on the river instead. The bridge was slick with the morning dew, each step making the wood whisper under my boots. I leaned against the railing, watching the water. The surface was smoother than last night, the current moving in long, unbroken lines. Reeves would have said the river was thinking. I smiled at the thought. When I was a boy, before I ever wore a uniform, I used to fish with my father in a stream not much bigger than this. He'd tell me the trick wasn't patience, it was paying attention. If you stared at the water long enough, you'd see the small changes, the way a shadow passed, the way a ripple widened, the way the light bent around a stone in the war. I learned to watch the world like that again, not for fish, but for survival. Yet now, leaning here in the safety of my own town, I found myself simply watching for beauty. I closed my eyes. The sound of the river carried me back to a morning years ago. We were camped near a stream. It's the air cold enough to make your teeth ache when you spoke. The water was our only mirror. Some men shaved in it, wincing as the icy current touched their faces. Others filled canteens, their breath rising in clouds. I remember kneeling there, splashing my hands when Reeves sat beside me. "You ever wonder," he said, "if we'll wake up one day and this will all feel like a dream?" I didn't answer right away. "Maybe," I said finally. "But I think dreams are quieter than this." He laughed, that short, warm laugh of his. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out an apple, split it in half with his knife, and handed me a piece. The crunch of that bite was louder in my memory than any gunfire. The river below me now shimmered in the light, as if it had heard that memory and kept it for me. I stayed there until the sun lifted itself over the rooftops. Then I turned back toward the square. The cafe was open now, the chime ringing as two men went inside. I followed them in, the smell of cinnamon stronger in the morning air. The waitress, the same girl as yesterday, greeted me with a smile. "It's back again," she said. "Seems so," I replied. She didn't ask for my order. She just nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Sat at the same table by the window. The smooth, stone-eyed left on the sill was still there, though someone had turned it so the flat side faced in. For a moment, it felt like a conversation, silent but acknowledged. When the tea came, it was just as I remembered, steam curling upward, the honey glinting at the bottom of the cup. I took a sip and let the warmth travel slowly, as if I had all the time in the world. I watched the square through the cafe window as I drank. The shopkeepers were beginning their morning rituals, sweeping the front steps, opening shutters, greeting one another with nods that said more than words. A boy passed by, balancing a bundle of newspapers under one arm. He tossed them onto doorsteps without slowing his pace. For a moment, I thought I recognized the angle of his jaw, the way his head tilted when he looked at something in the distance. But of course, it wasn't Reeves. My mind plays those tricks. More often these days, the chime on the cafe door rang again, and a man in his 40s walked in. He had the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. His coat was worn but clean, his boots polished enough to catch the light. He looked at me for just a second too long before taking a seat at the counter. I wondered if he recognized me from somewhere, perhaps from those black and white photographs in the town hall, the ones they bring out on certain holidays. I turned my attention back to my tea. The honey had settled in a thin crescent at the bottom of the cup. I stirred it slowly, watching the gold dissolve into the amber, and just like that, I was back in the field hospital. The tea there came in tin cups, often lukewarm and tasting faintly of the pot it had been boiled in. But one morning, I woke to find a small jar of honey on the crate beside my bed. No note, no explanation. I hadn't tasted honey in months. It felt like a treasure, and I didn't dare finish it all at once. Each day, I'd take just a little, letting it melt on my tongue before the noise of the day began. To this day, I never learned who left it for me, and maybe it's better that way. Some kindnesses are meant to be anonymous. They belong more to the world than to any one person. The waitress brought a small plate to my table without a word. 2 slices of bread, still warm, with a pat of butter slowly softening in the center. "On the house," she said, as if that explained everything. I thanked her, though my voice came out softer than I expected. Bread and butter, it sounds like nothing, but to a man who once counted crumbs, it's a feast outside. The square had begun to fill. A farmer's cart rolled in, piled high with vegetables. Children chased each other between the stalls as merchants set up. The smell of fresh earth and herbs drifted through the open cafe door. It reminded me of a market in a village far from here, a place we stumbled into on a supply run. I remember how alive it felt, the air thick with the scent of spices, the chatter of voices bargaining over produce. For a few hours, we were just men buying food, not soldiers passing through. Reeves bought a string of dried peppers and carried them in his pack for weeks, claiming they'd keep the cold away. I finished my tea and bread slowly, letting the morning move at its own pace. When I finally stood to leave, the waitress smiled in that way people do when they're not just being polite, when they actually see you, back on the bench. I unfolded the letter again. I didn't read it this time. I just let it rest open on my lap, the words breathing in the morning air. The river was still there in the distance, and for a moment it felt as if both of us, the letter and I, were waiting for the same thing, though neither of us knew what it was. I left the bench and walked toward the square. The morning sun had climbed high enough to warm the stones under my boots, and the market was now alive with color and sound. Stalls lined the edges, each with its own kind of music, the rustle of leafy greens being bundled, the gentle thud of bread loaves being set down, the crisp snap of cloth as vendors adjusted their awnings. Somewhere, someone strummed a guitar, the tune wandering lazily over the crowd. A woman selling apples called out to me. She wore a wide straw hat, and her hands moved quickly, polishing each apple against her apron before placing it in a basket. "You've been sitting on that bench too much," she said with a grin. "Come, take something sweet." Her voice pulled me back decades in an instant. There had been another apple seller once, near the train station where we boarded for the front. She had stood behind her cart in the early light, handing fruit to the men who passed. I remember she pressed one into my hand without asking for payment. Her eyes sang what her mouth didn't dare. "Come back safe." I bought 2 apples from the woman now and slipped one into my coat pocket beside the letter. The other I bit into, the sharp sweetness pulling me entirely into the present for a moment. A few stalls down, I stopped to look at a table of old books. The covers were worn, the spines curved from years of being read and passed along. A bookseller, an elderly man with round glasses, noticed my interest. "Looking for something in particular?" he asked. "Not really," I said. "Just seeing what's survived." He chuckled, running his fingers along the row. "Survival is a kind of story on its own," he said. That sentence followed me as I wandered on. Survival is a story. In the war, it was a story you told yourself every morning so you could stand up again. Out here, in the quiet years after, it's a story you tell in smaller ways, and sitting on the same bench every day, and keeping a letter folded neatly in your pocket, and leaving a smooth stone on a WINDOWSILL dot at the far end of the square. Near the bakery, I saw a young man playing chess with himself at a small table. His pieces were mismatched, some carved from wood, others polished bone, one clearly a button pressed into service as a pawn. I stopped to watch a moment. "My father taught me," he said without looking up. Said it was the one battle worth fighting every day. I smiled. "And do you win?" "It's Tom's," he said, finally glancing up. "Sometimes I let the other side win." There was wisdom in that, the kind of quiet wisdom the war had taught me too late. By noon, the market began to thin. Sun was warm now, and I felt the weight of the apple and the letter in my pocket. I decided to walk toward the river again before returning to my bench. The path here took me past the old post office, its paint peeling, the front steps uneven from years of use. I stopped at the doorway, remembering the field post tents from the war canvas walls. Tables stacked with envelopes, men sorting and stamping as if the whole outcome depended on getting those words home. Once, I had delivered a letter for a friend who couldn't write, not because he didn't know how, but because the words wouldn't come. I sat beside him in the dim light of a lantern, asking him questions until the sentences formed, and then I wrote them down. When it was done, he folded the paper and looked at it as though it were a fragile bird he'd managed to catch. I never asked if he got a reply. Some things you leave alone. Back at the river, the light was different now, brighter, but less forgiving. The water caught every glint of sun, throwing it back into my eyes. I leaned against the railing, listening, feeling the steady hum beneath the sound. The war slept here, I thought again, not in forgetting, but in the way the town let the past breathe without forcing it awake. I turned back toward the square. The bench was waiting, the flag above it shifting just enough to make that soft, page-turning sound. I sat down, placing the apple beside me, and unfolded the letter once more. This time, I read it silently, all the way through. And for a moment, I felt something loosen, not leave, not vanish, but loosen, like a knot finally understanding it doesn't have to hold so tight. The afternoon thinned into that gentle, in-between time when the market stalls were gone. The shopkeepers rested in their doorways, and the shadows grew longer, but not yet deep. I stayed on the bench, the apple untouched beside me. The letter was folded again, resting in my pocket, but its words still hummed in my mind like the aftertaste of a song. Across the square, a boy sat on the steps of the closed post office, fiddling with something in his hands. From here, I could see it was a small wooden whistle, the kind you find at some affairs. He blew into it once, a sharp, short note, then turned it over and examined the grain as if it might reveal a secret. I knew that whistle. Not that exact one, but the kind. In the war, there was a young runner named Mitchell who carried one everywhere, but it was from his sister to call home if you get lost. He never used it for that, but sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, he'd sit cross-legged by the fire and play a tune so simple it felt like it could keep you alive. The boy on the steps glanced up and caught me watching. For a moment, I thought he might come over, but instead, he tucked the whistle into his pocket and ran off toward the river. Steps echoing in the stillness. The cafe door opened, the chime carrying across the square. The waitress from the morning stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked around as if searching for someone, then spotted me. "You didn't finish your bread," she called with a small smile. "I was saving it," I said. "For what?" I thought about that. "Maybe for tomorrow." She shook her head, amused, and went back inside. The flag above me shifted again, just enough to whisper its fabric sound. In another life, that sound meant orders were coming. Now, it only meant the evening breeze had found its way through town as the sky began to change. The light went from gold to a muted rose, and the air took on that almost silent chill that makes you notice your own breath. I picked up the apple at my side, polished it against my coat, and took a bite. It was sweeter now. It's a kind of sweetness that feels like it's been waiting all day to be tasted, somewhere beyond the hills. A train horn sounded again, not loud, not urgent, just there, a reminder that some things keep moving whether you watch them or not. And I thought, as I sat there chewing slowly, that maybe tomorrow I would finally read the letter aloud. Maybe not all of it. Maybe just the first line, but not tonight. Tonight, the war could keep sleeping. I could keep waking the morning someone sat beside me. The morning began differently when I reached the bench beneath the flag. It wasn't empty. A woman sat there already, her hands folded neatly in, her lap a wicker basket at her feet. She was older, not quite my age, but close enough to remember the years I remember. Her hair was silver, gathered at the nape of her neck with a ribbon that caught the early light. I slowed my steps. Most people leave the bench for me, not because it's mine, it isn't, but because, over the years, it's become a quiet, understanding. Yet she didn't move, and I didn't mind. "Good morning," I said. She nodded. "It is." I sat at the other end, the flag's shadow cutting a faint line between us. The breeze was cool, carrying the smell of damp leaves. From somewhere up the street, after a few moments, she spoke again. "You're the man who comes here every day." "I suppose I am." "Huh? And you carry something in your pocket." Her eyes flicked to my coat. "A letter." I felt my chest tighten, though not in a painful way. "I do." She didn't ask what it said. Instead, she reached into her basket and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. She set it on the bench between us. "For you," she said. I hesitated. "It's only bread," she added, as if that explained everything. I untied the string carefully, the paper crackling under my fingers. Inside was a loaf, still warm, its crust dusted with flour. The smell was enough to pull me backward in time before I'd even touched it. The bakery, the silver-haired woman, the loaf she had pressed into my hands without asking for payment. I looked at the ribbon in this woman's hair again and realized this was her daughter. The same eyes, the same way of watching the road, as if it might carry someone home. "You look like her," I said quietly. "She told me about you," she replied. "Not much, it's just that you were polite and that you always said thank you." I wanted to tell her more about the day I first took that bread, about how the smell of it kept me steady for weeks. But the words stayed where they were, deep in the part of me that still holds certain things in silence. Instead, I broke off a piece of the loaf and ate it slowly, letting the crust crackle, the soft center warm my mouth. She ate a piece too, and for a few minutes, we didn't speak. The flag shifted overhead, making that familiar page-turning sound. I thought of the letter in my pocket, and for the first time in years, I considered handing it to someone, but not today. When she stood to leave, she placed the rest of the loaf back in her basket. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, as she walked away, her steps unhurried, as if she knew the road would still be there when she came back. I watched her until she turned the corner, then leaned back against the bench, feeling the sunlight on my face. The war was still sleeping, and so was the letter. But something in me had woken, just enough to know that maybe one day soon I'd let it speak. She came back the next morning. I was already on the bench when she appeared, basket in hand, the ribbon in her hair catching the light just as it had the day before. This time, she didn't sit at the far end. She sat close enough that I could smell the faint sweetness of flour clinging to her clothes. "I brought tea today," she said, lifting a small thermos from the basket. She poured it into 2 enamel cups, the steam curling upward like the smoke from a quiet fire. It was chamomile, warm and soft on the tongue. "You take your tea without sugar?" she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Do I? You didn't put any in yesterday at the cafe." So she had been watching. For a while, we just sat, sipping in silence. I've learned over the years that silence is not always the absence of conversation. Sometimes it's the conversation itself. She was the one who broke it. My mother baked every day during the war, even when there was almost nothing to bake with. She said it kept the air in the house from feeling too cold. I nodded. "She gave me bread once." "I know," the woman said. She told me, "You carried it for 3 days before you ate it." I smiled faintly. It felt like something that should last. The flag above us stirred in the breeze. I reached into my pocket and felt the folded paper. I hadn't planned to, but my fingers slipped it free. The creases were deep now. The ink faded into a soft brown. She glanced at it, but didn't ask. Instead, she said, "My mother used to write letters to my father while he was away. She never knew if he read them. She said it didn't matter. The writing was for her as much as for him." I turned the paper in my hand the way you might turn a stone you've carried for years before finally deciding to skip it across the water. "I wrote this during the war," I said quietly. "Never sent it." Her eyes met mine, not with curiosity, but with something gentler, patience. I unfolded it. My voice felt strange at first, as if unused to this kind of speaking. "If I make it back," I began, and the words fell into the morning air. I read the first few lines about bread, about rain, about the way light fell on her hands when she worked. My voice faltered halfway through, and I folded the paper again. "That's enough for today," I said. She nodded, and I knew she understood. When she left, she placed a small, wrapped roll on the bench beside me. "For later," she said. I waited until she was out of sight before unwrapping it. The smell rose up, warm and familiar, and for the first time in a long while, I ate without saving any for tomorrow. That evening, I didn't go straight home. The air was too calm, the light too patient, and I felt as if the river had been calling me all day. I took the long way past the bakery where the last loaves were cooling on the racks, past the post office where the steps were empty but still held the warmth of the afternoon, past the corner where the boy with the wooden whistle had sat. By the time I reached the bridge, the sun was lowering into the hills, turning the water into a sheet of molten gold. The current was slow, unhurried, as if even it knew the day didn't need to end quickly. I leaned on the railing and let my hands rest there, feeling the grain of the wood. The sound of the water was low but steady, the kind of sound that slips under your thoughts instead of replacing them. And that's when I remembered the last letter I ever sent during the war. It wasn't long, barely a page. I'd written it on the back of a supply manifest because there was no clean paper left. The ink bled in places where the paper had been damp. It wasn't a love letter or even a farewell. It was a promise, small, plain one. If I make it back. I'd written, I'll plant the rosemary in the corner of the garden again. I don't know why I chose rosemary. Maybe because it had always been there in the yard when I was a boy, and the smell of it in the sun felt like home. Maybe because rosemary is for remembrance, and I was afraid of forgetting who I was before the war. I mailed that letter through the field post, not knowing if it would ever arrive. I never got an answer. But years later, when I came back, there was rosemary growing in the corner of the garden. The wind shifted on the bridge, carrying with it the faint scent of something herbal from a kitchen nearby. Maybe thyme, maybe sage. But for a heartbeat, I could have sworn it was rosemary. The light faded into the blue of evening. I stood there until the first stars appeared, then made my way back to the square. The bench was empty now, the flag overhead barely visible in the dim. I sat down, the letter still in my pocket, warm from the day's touch. I thought of reading more of it tomorrow, or maybe just letting it rest another day. There's no rush. Some words ripen slowly, like fruit that refuses to be picked before its time. The war was still sleeping. That evening, I didn't go straight home. The air was too calm, the light too patient, and I felt as if the river had been calling me all day. I took the long way past the bakery where the last loaves were cooling on the racks, past the post office where the steps were empty but still held the warmth of the afternoon, past the corner where the boy with the wooden whistle had sat. By the time I reached the bridge, the sun was lowering into the hills, turning the water into a sheet of molten gold. The current was slow, unhurried, as if even it knew the day didn't need to end quickly. I leaned on the railing and let my hands rest there, feeling the grain of the wood. The sound of the water was low but steady, the kind of sound that slips under your thoughts instead of replacing them. And that's when I remembered the last letter I ever sent during the war. It wasn't long, barely a page. I'd written it on the back of a supply manifest because there was no clean paper left. The ink bled in places where the paper had been damp. It wasn't a love letter or even a farewell. It was a promise, small, plain one. If I make it back. I'd written, I'll plant the rosemary in the corner of the garden again. I don't know why I chose rosemary. Maybe because it had always been there in the yard when I was a boy, and the smell of it in the sun felt like home. Maybe because rosemary is for remembrance, and I was afraid of forgetting who I was before the war. I mailed that letter through the field post, not knowing if it would ever arrive. I never got an answer. But years later, when I came back, there was rosemary growing in the corner of the garden. The wind shifted on the bridge, carrying with it the faint scent of something herbal from a kitchen nearby. Maybe thyme, maybe sage. But for a heartbeat, I could have sworn it was rosemary. The light faded into the blue of evening. I stood there until the first stars appeared, then made my way back to the square. The bench was empty now, the flag overhead barely visible in the dim. I sat down, the letter still in my pocket, warm from the day's touch. I thought of reading more of it tomorrow, or maybe just letting it rest another day. There's no rush. Some words ripen slowly, like fruit that refuses to be picked before its time. The war was still sleeping. The day the wind carried a voice. The morning came with wind. Not the harsh, cold kind that hurries you indoors, but a steady, restless breeze that made the flag above my bench speak more than usual. It flapped and sighed, folding and unfolding, as if it were trying to remind me of something. The sky was pale, the color of worn linen, and the air carried the smell of the sea more strongly than it had in weeks. Somewhere, a gull cried, its voice sharp against the stillness of the square. When I reached the bench, someone had been there before me. A single sheet of paper rested on the wood, pinned by a small stone. I lifted the stone, curious. The paper was not a letter, but a page torn from a book, a novel, judging by the printed words. Half a sentence caught my eye, and he knew that some stories could only be told when the wind was listening. I smiled because the wind was certainly listening today. I set the page aside and sat, the letter in my pocket, feeling heavier than usual. The ribbon-haired woman didn't come that morning, and for a moment I missed her more than I expected. I had grown used to her quiet presence. It's the way she let the silences between us fill without crowding them. The wind carried the scent of bread from the bakery, but also something else, wood smoke, faint and familiar. It took me straight back to a winter in the war when the only fire we had was a small, stubborn one we built in a hollow between two hills. The smoke had clung to our coats for days afterward. Reeves said it was the smell of survival. I reached for the letter, my fingers tracing the creases. The wind tugged at it when I unfolded it, as though it wanted to read over my shoulder. I began, quietly, almost to myself. If I make it back. The words trembled, not from the cold, but from something inside me that still wasn't used to being heard. I want to remember the smell of bread before it's cut, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the way light falls on your hands when you're working, the warmth of tea in the morning when you didn't think you'd see another one. Porned. Caught the page then, fluttering it like a living thing. I held it firmly, smiling at the thought that maybe the wind wasn't just listening. Maybe it was trying to carry the words somewhere. I didn't read the rest, not yet, but I'd gone further than before. When I rose to leave, I placed the small stone from the stranger's page next to my own smooth stone on the cafe windowsill. Two markers, side by side, without explanation. By afternoon, the wind had eased. The sky had taken on that soft, gold-washed light that makes every shadow look longer and slower. I'd left the bench for a short walk, but when I returned, she was there. The ribbon in her hair was the same pale blue as before, though today it seemed to catch the light differently, like water shifting under sunlight. The wicker basket sat at her feet, and she was holding a book closed on her lap. "You weren't here this morning," I said. "I was baking," she replied, and thinking about something. She didn't offer what the something was, and I didn't ask. We've both lived long enough to know that some thoughts arrive, like guests who need a little more time before they're ready to come inside. From her basket, she pulled out a small tin and set it between us. "Shortbread," she said. "Try one." Took a piece, biting into it slowly. Butter was rich, the texture just crumbly enough to melt in the mouth. "My mother made these," she said softly, "on the days she was most afraid." Said. The smell kept her hands from shaking. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the flag's faint rustle above. "Huh?" Then she glanced at my coat pocket. "Did you read more of it?" I nodded. "This morning." The wind tried to take it from me. Her lips curved into a small smile. Maybe it wanted to help carry it. I reached into my pocket, feeling the paper there, lighter than it had been, though I couldn't explain why. "I'm close," I said, closer than I've been in years. She didn't say anything. She just poured tea from a small flask she'd brought, the steam rising between us, the scent of chamomile again. As we drank, the square began to quiet. The shop shutters closed, the last of the market stalls were dismantled, and the air filled with that stillness that comes before the first evening lamps are lit. When she stood to leave, she touched the bench with her fingertips, almost like one might pat the shoulder of an old friend. "Tomorrow," she said, "bring the rest of it." I watched her walk away, the ribbon in her hair swaying with each step, and I thought, perhaps I will. The square was nearly empty now. A few stragglers crossed from one side to the other, their steps quickened by the cooling air. Somewhere behind the buildings, a door shut with a hollow sound. The faint smell of wood smoke began to drift in. I stayed on the bench. The flag above me barely moved, only a slow, occasional shift that sounded more like a sigh than a wave. From the cafe, light spilled onto the cobblestones. The smooth stone I'd left on the windowsill sat exactly where I'd placed it yesterday, but beside it, there was now a second one. I didn't know who had left it, but I liked the idea that the windowsill was becoming a small, quiet ledger of presence. The letter was in my pocket, warm from the hours it had been resting there. I didn't take it out, but I touched it through the fabric, feeling the familiar corners. The wind had read more of it today than anyone else had in years. The street lamps began to hum as they came to life, their lights soft and pale against the stones. The sound of the river was just faint enough to seem like it might be part of the wind. I thought about her words, "Tomorrow, bring the rest of it." It wasn't an order. It wasn't even a request. It was an opening, left in the air like a door not quite closed. I leaned back on the bench, letting the night take the square, and decided, not with a rush, not with a grand declaration, but the way one decides to breathe deeper, that yes, tomorrow I would bring it all. The war could stay sleeping a little longer tonight. Tomorrow, the letter would wake, the day the letter breathed. The morning came with the kind of light that doesn't rush in, but spills slowly, as if it knows there's something important to witness. The flag above the bench was already moving. When I arrived, its fabric catching the early wind in slow, measured sways. The ribbon-haired woman was there before me, sitting in her usual place with a wicker basket resting against her legs. She looked up and gave a small, knowing nod. "You brought it," she said. I did. The letter felt different in my pocket today. Not lighter, not heavier, but ready. I sat beside her, the wood of the bench warm from the sun. She poured tea from her flask into the 2 enamel cups we'd shared before. The steam rose between us, carrying the scent of chamomile. For a moment, we just held our cups, listening to the faint rustle of the flag and the distant murmur of the river. When I unfolded the letter, the paper resisted at first, the old creases reluctant to let go. But then it lay open in my hands, the ink pale but clear enough to read. I began softly. "If I make it back, I want to remember the smell of bread before it's cut, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the way light falls on your hands when you're working, the warmth of tea in the morning when you didn't think you'd see another one. I want to remember the curve of the street at dusk, the smell of rosemary in the garden, the way the river sounds after a storm. I want to remember that even in the quiet, there was life. And if I make it back, I want to plant something, anything, so that even when I'm gone, something will keep growing." I paused, the last lines waiting on my tongue. She didn't look at me. She looked at the square, as if giving me space to decide whether to finish. And I continued, my voice lower now. "If I make it back, I want to see your face in the sun again. Just once would be enough. More would be a gift." The silence followed, the good kind, the kind that settles instead of lingers. When I folded the letter, she didn't reach for it, and I didn't offer. It had been written for one person, but today it had been read for 2. The tea was cooler now, but still sweet. She finished hers, then reached into her basket and placed a small sprig of rosemary on the bench between us. "For the garden," she said, and just like that, the letter had done its work. We left the bench together. It wasn't planned. There was no "shall we" or "let's go." She simply rose with her basket, and I found myself standing too. Our steps fell into the same rhythm without effort. We walked toward the river, the rosemary sprig in my hand. Scent was stronger in the sun, carrying me back to a place far from here. It had been late spring in that other place, though spring there meant something different. The ground was hard, the grass thin, but a small patch of green clung to the edge of a ruined wall. Reeves spotted it first. "Rosemary," he said, crouching to touch it. We stood there for a moment, the two of us, just looking at it. In a world where everything seemed to be taken apart, here was something that had refused to be. He broke off a small piece and handed it to me. "For luck," he said. I kept it in my breast pocket for weeks until it crumbled into dust. I never told him that I kept smelling my hands after touching it, just to hold on a little longer. The river shimmered ahead of us now, slow and silver in the midday light. We stopped at the bridge, leaning on the railing. She set her basket down and looked out over the water. "My father never came back," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. She didn't explain how she knew I knew, and I didn't explain how I knew she knew about me either. Some understandings live without being spoken. I turned the rosemary in my fingers. I came back. It was already growing in my garden, I said. I'd written once that I wanted to plant it again, but someone else must have done it before I returned. She looked at me, her eyes soft but steady. "Maybe they wanted you to come home to something that was already waiting." We stayed there until the sun shifted, the shadows of the railing stretching longer over the water. Then, without saying goodbye, we walked back to the square together. At the bench, she placed her basket down and began to untie the ribbon in her hair. "For the rosemary," she said, looping the ribbon gently around the sprig in my hand. I didn't argue. Some gestures are meant to be accepted, not questioned. Twilight crept into the square without ceremony. The air cooled, the cobblestones darkened, and the first lamps blinked to life, casting soft circles of light on the ground. I sat on the bench again, the ribbon sprig of rosemary in my hand. The ribbon was pale blue, the same shade as the one in her hair each morning, and it seemed to hold a warmth of its own. The letter rested open on my lap. The words had been read now, their silence broken, yet they felt just as alive as when they'd been folded away for decades. I smoothed the paper with my palm, feeling its slight tremble in the evening breeze. Carefully, I slid the rosemary inside, its scent mingling with the faint trace of ink and time. Folding the letter around it, I tied the ribbon once, loosely, so it could be undone without tearing. It didn't feel like closing something. It felt like keeping it company. The flag above me moved with a low, steady sound, no longer the restless whisper of the morning wind, but a slower rhythm, almost like breathing. Somewhere, the river carried on in the dark, steady and unseen, the same way it had every night I'd been here. A train horn sounded far away, not sharp, not hurried, just enough to mark that someone, somewhere, was on their way home. I leaned back, letting the night settle over the square. The letter and the rosemary rested together in my pocket. The bench solid beneath me, the flag overhead. The war was still sleeping, but tonight the letter would dream. The morning the bench was empty twice. The morning was clear, the flag above, the bench moving gently in the first light. The air carried the clean scent of rain from the night before. Though the cobblestones were already dry, I arrived early, earlier than usual, but I wasn't the only one who noticed. The bench seemed to notice too. It sat there in its place as always, but without her basket beside it. Without the faint sound of her footsteps approaching, it felt like it was holding its breath. I waited. The minutes passed quietly, marked only by the soft sway of the flag and the distant clink of cups being set out at the cafe. The letter was still in my pocket, the rosemary inside it, the ribbon tied around it as it had been last night. I had thought she would see it this morning, but she didn't come. I told myself she might have been delayed. Perhaps the oven at the bakery had needed tending. Perhaps she'd stopped to speak to someone along the way. Yet, as the shadows shifted on the stones and the sun crept higher, the absence began to feel heavier than the letter in my pocket. By mid-morning, I stood, brushing the bench with my palm before leaving. The street toward the bakery was quiet. The window was open, the smell of bread spilling out in warm waves. But there was no ribbon-haired woman at the counter. Instead, an older man I'd seen only once before stood there, flour on his forearms. "She's not in today," he said. Before I could ask, "Had to tend to something at home." I nodded. "Tell her I stopped by." He gave a short smile. "She know." I left the bakery with nothing in my hands, walking without aim until my feet took me toward the river. The bridge was quiet, the water smooth. I leaned on the railing, thinking of the first time she'd spoken to me. The way her voice had matched the calm of the morning then. From my pocket, I took the letter, still tied with the ribbon. I held it in both hands, feeling its weight, not heavy, but certain. The rosemary's scent rose faintly in the breeze, and for a moment I wondered if she could somehow smell it, too, wherever she was. I stayed on the bridge longer than usual, then returned to the square. The bench was still there, waiting, and, though it was empty, it no longer felt alone. The square had grown quieter by the afternoon. The market stalls were gone, leaving only the faint scent of herbs and fruit where they had stood. Even the flag above the bench seemed to move less, as if the day itself were holding back. I found myself walking without much thought. I stepped, turning down a narrow side street I rarely used. It was shaded here, the cobblestones damp from where the sun hadn't yet reached. Her house wasn't far, a modest place with pale shutters and a small garden in front. I knew it only from passing by. The rosemary grew thick in the corner, brushing against the fence when the wind leaned in. When I reached the gate, I paused. It wasn't hesitation exactly, more the weight of an old habit, the one that tells you to measure the moment before crossing into someone else's space. During the war, visiting someone's home, if they still had one, was different. You not knowing the news you brought might change them. Sometimes you arrived carrying hope, sometimes not, and sometimes you stood at the gate and decided that leaving quietly was kinder. Today, I knocked. The door opened after a moment, and there she was. No ribbon in her hair this time, only the loose fall of silver strands against her shoulders. She looked surprised at first, then not at all. "I was going to come tomorrow," she said. "I noticed you weren't at the bench." She stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the air was warm with the scent of baking, something sweeter than bread, something that spoke of comfort made for someone else. On the table was a plate of rolls dusted with sugar, a pot of tea waiting beside them. "I thought you might come," she said, pouring tea into 2 cups. "It's strange, isn't it? How quickly you can get used to someone being part of your mornings." I smiled at that. Strange, yes, but not unwelcome. The tea was fragrant, laced with lemon. I sipped slowly, my eyes catching the ribbon lying on the table beside her. It's pale blue, folded neatly, as if it had been taken off with care. We spoke, little, letting the sound of the clock in the corner fill the room. Before I left, she wrapped 2 of the sugared rolls in paper and placed them in my hands. "For tomorrow," she said. I stepped back into the street with the letter still in my pocket, the ribbon still tied around it, the rosemary inside. And as I walked toward the square, I knew that tomorrow, the bench would not be empty twice. What we brought back, she was there before me. The ribbon was back in her hair, though today it was tied a little lower, as if it had been done in a hurry. The wicker basket sat beside her, but I noticed it was lighter. She carried it more like a habit than a weight. "You didn't knock this morning?" she said with a faint smile. I figured the bench would be the right place for us both. I sat down beside her. The flag above gave a soft, folding sound in the wind, and for a moment it was as though the days between our first meeting and now had been sewn together without a seam. She poured tea from her flask, the steam curling upward into the cool air. This time the scent was mint, sharp, clean, and a little unexpected. "You once told me you wrote that letter during the war," she began. "Yes, and you never sent it." "No," she nodded, looking into her cup. "I wrote letters too. Dozens. Some I sent. Some I didn't. I still have the ones I kept. My mother used to say that the unsent letters are the truest because you write them without expecting an answer." I thought about that, my eyes drifting toward the flag. Maybe that's why I kept mine. It didn't need to travel anywhere. It just needed to stay. We sat quietly for a while, each of us tracing the shape of our own memories. Then she said something I didn't expect. "What did you bring back?" I wasn't sure how to answer. People ask about medals, about scars, about photographs, but what did you bring back is different. "Some things I chose," I said finally. "Some I didn't. I brought back the habit of noticing small sounds, footsteps, the way a door closes, the rustle of fabric. I brought back the weight of a pack, even when I'm not carrying one. And I brought back a river I can't stop hearing." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "I brought back smells. My father's coat after he'd been near the sea. Bread, fresh from the oven, on days when the world felt smaller. And rosemary." I smiled. "We have that one in common." From her basket, she took out 2 sprigs, freshly cut. She handed me one, keeping the other for herself. "For the garden," she said again, as she had before. The wind lifted the flag above us, and, for a moment, I could hear nothing but its low, steady rhythm. We left the bench without speaking, falling into step as though the idea to walk had been shared without words. The square was quieter now. Most of the morning's life had faded, leaving only the low murmur of voices from the cafe and the occasional sound of a cartwheel on the stones. The road to the river was dappled with shifting sunlight, its breeze carrying a cool edge from the water ahead. She carried her basket lightly, the sprig of rosemary I'd given her resting on top. When we reached the bridge, we stopped in the middle, leaning on the railing. The water was slow today, its surface broken only by the occasional leaf drifting. Along, she was the first to speak. "I don't talk about the people I lost," she said quietly. "I don't either," I replied. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where each of us seemed to be holding something with care. Finally, she said, "I think it's because saying their names would make them belong to the past, and some days I want them to stay here with me." I nodded. "I understand. I hear them in sounds. The way a boot scrapes stone, the way a whistle carries in the morning, even the way rain falls differently in some seasons. They stay there. In those things." She turned the rosemary sprig in her fingers. "Maybe that's why I keep planting this. It's not just for the garden." "Then we'll plant it," I said. "Both of us, one in your garden, one in mine. And when it blooms, we'll know the others is blooming too." She smiled at that, not a wide smile, but one that settled in her eyes. We stayed there a while longer, the river below moving at its own pace, carrying our reflections in soft, uneven shapes. By the time we walked back to the square, the light had begun to change, tilting toward evening. At the bench, she set her basket down and touched the wood with her fingertips, the same way she always did before leaving. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," I echoed as she walked away. The ribbon in her hair caught the wind. lifting just slightly enough to remind me of the flag above the bench. Steady, but always listening, the ground remembers. The next morning, I didn't go straight to the bench. Instead, I walked to my garden, a small patch behind the house. Nothing grand. The soil there is dark and soft, the kind that welcomes whatever you place in it. The rosemary sprig from yesterday lay on the table inside, the pale blue ribbon still tied loosely around it. I untied it carefully, folding the ribbon and slipping it into my pocket before stepping out into the morning light. There's a quiet in gardens. It's different from the quiet in the streets or on riverbanks. It's a listening quiet, the kind that notices every shift, a bee landing, a leaf turning toward the sun, the faint sigh of roots drinking water deep below. I dug a small hollow in the soil, the scent of earth rising as I worked. Holding the rosemary in my hand, I felt its small, stubborn weight, a living thing that carried its own history. I placed it gently into the ground, covering the base with soil, pressing just enough to steady it without taking away its space to breathe. As I did, my mind carried me to another patch of earth. Far from here, it had been behind a crumbling wall. In a village we passed through one spring. Thor had stripped almost everything from that place, but in one corner there was a garden, wild, half swallowed by weeds. Among them, a soldier from another unit knelt, planting something small and green. What's the point? Someone had asked him. He looked up, his hands still in the soil. The point is that someday, someone else will stand here and see it. And maybe they'll know we were more than just the noise. I never learned his name. I never saw that garden again, but the memory stayed, the way he placed that small plant into the ground with more care than I'd seen given to anything in weeks back in my own garden. I finished pressing the soil around the rosemary, then stood for a moment, looking at it. The air was cool, but the sun was steady. And I imagined the roots already beginning their slow, patient work. When I walked to the bench later, the ribbon-haired woman was waiting. You planted it? She said, without asking. I did. Her eyes softened. Then mine goes in the ground this afternoon. The flag above us stirred in the breeze, its sound folding into the quiet between our words. For a moment, it felt as if the two gardens were already speaking to each other. She met me at her gate just after midday. The pale shutters behind her opened to let in the early warmth. The wicker basket was on her arm again, but instead of bread, it carried a small trowel, a coil of twine, and the rosemary sprig I had given her. Come, she said, leading me through the narrow path between the rosemary hedge and a row of faded hollyhocks. Her garden wasn't large, but it was alive in the way that only gardens tended by careful hands can be. Every plant seemed to be exactly where it belonged. She stopped at a small, bare patch near the fence, the soil already turned over. This is where I thought it should go, she said. I nodded. It'll get the morning light here. We knelt together. She dug the hole, her movements practiced, the earth parting easily under her hands, held the rosemary steady while she tucked the soil back around it, pressing gently. The scent rose, immediately, fresh, sharp, a little wild as we worked. I told her about the soldier I'd seen planting in the ruins. I never knew his name, I said, but I can still see his hands rough from weeks without rest, dirt under every nail, moving like he was tucking in a child. He said the point was that someday someone would see it and know we were more than just the noise. She looked up from the soil, her eyes resting on me for a long moment. Hope someone did. So do I. When the plant was settled, she wound a small loop of twine around its base, not to bind it, but to mark it, as if to say, this one matters. We sat back on our heels, looking at the patch of earth in silence. The rosemary seemed impossibly small now, but I knew it would grow. That was the nature of it, to keep going quietly, till one day It filled the space it had been given. She brushed the soil from her hands and stood, offering me her arm in that casual, unthinking way that happens only when it feels natural. We walked back to the gate together, the faint scent of rosemary trailing after us. "Tomorrow," she said as I stepped onto the street, "we'll check them both." And I realized she didn't mean just the plants, the morning of two gardens. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that makes you wonder if it's been there all along and you just forgot to look up. When I reached the bench, she was already waiting, a sprig of something green peeking out from her basket. "They're both standing," she said, before I could even sit. "Good," I replied. "So start." We didn't need to say what we were talking about. Candace had joined the conversation without either of us asking them to. She poured tea into our cups, mint again, cool on the tongue, even while it was warm in the hands. "Do you know the thing about rosemary?" she asked. "That is for remembrance," I said. She nodded. "Yes, but also for resilience. You can neglect it for weeks and it will still hold on. The scent stays, even in the driest season." Thought about that as we drank. Resilience wasn't something you set out to have. You didn't plant it. It just happened quietly when you kept showing up to the bench, to the garden, to the people who stayed. After the tea, we walked together to see her plant. The soil was still dark from yesterday's work, the rosemary small but upright, its leaves catching the morning light. She crouched to touch it, and I noticed the way her hand lingered there, as though it was listening. Then we walked to mine. It looked much the same, though a single bead of water clung to one leaf, left over from the dew. She saw it too, and smiled. Even the small things get their share. We stood there for a moment longer, then made our way back to the square. At the bench, she reached into her basket and pulled out 2 small bundles wrapped in paper. "Bread," she said, "for lunch, but not to save." I laughed softly, taking mine. "You've been watching me too closely." The flag overhead moved once, twice, then fell still again, as if it were satisfied with the morning's work. We ate the bread on the walk to the river. It was still warm from the oven, the crust crackling faintly as we broke it apart. She had tucked a bit of rosemary into hers, just enough for the scent to rise with each bite. By the time we reached the bridge, the water was moving slow and smooth, the sunlight turning it the color of old brass. We leaned on the railing, our elbows almost touching, watching the ripples spread in soft, uneven circles. "It wasn't the noise that stayed with me," I said, after a while. "It was the quiet after. The weeks when there was no shouting, no engines, no gunfire, just nothing. I didn't know what to do with it." She nodded. "When my father didn't come back, the house became quiet in a way that was different from before. My mother filled it with baking, I think, so it wouldn't swallow us whole." I glanced at her. "Did it work?" "Some days," she said. "Others, the smell of bread only made the emptiness louder." The river shifted under a gust of wind, breaking the reflections into small fragments. I watched them stitch themselves back together as the current calmed. "After the war," I said, "I thought I'd be able to step straight back into the life I had before. Key, but it's like trying to walk into a photograph. You can see it, you can touch it, but you can't live in it anymore." She rested her chin lightly on her hand, her eyes following the water. "That's why you come to the bench." I didn't answer right away. "It's part of it," I said finally. "But maybe I come because it's where the quiet feels safe, like it can stay without turning heavy." We stayed there until the light began to lower, the air cooling enough to make us turn our collars up. On the walk back, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. The sound of our steps on the cobblestones was enough when we reached the square. She touched the bench before leaving, as she always did. I sat down and watched her go, the pale blue ribbon in her hair lifting once in the breeze before falling still. The morning the rosemary spoke first when I stepped into the square. The bench was empty. The flag above it swayed gently, as if it were waving me along, rather than asking me to sit. I stood there for a moment, feeling the familiar pull of habit, then turned toward the narrow street that led to her house. Her gate was open. The scent of rosemary reached me before I reached the garden, sharper and greener than I remembered. She was kneeling beside the plant, her basket on the ground, the blue ribbon tied around her wrist instead of her hair. "It's grown," she said, without looking up. I crouched beside her. The sprig we'd planted together just days ago stood straighter now, new shoots already pushing at its base. It was nothing dramatic, it's just a fraction more, but it felt impossible for something to change so quickly without us noticing. Sometimes it's like that, she said, brushing the soil with her fingers. It works in silence, and then one morning, it speaks. I touched the leaves gently. They released their scent instantly, rush of something both old and new. "It reminds me of the last winter before I came home," I said. "We'd gone weeks with nothing green in sight. Then, one morning, near the edge of a frozen field, I saw a single blade of grass standing through the frost. Just one, and it felt like a message." She looked at me, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. What did it say? That the ground wasn't done yet? She sat back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Neither are we." We stayed there for a while, tending the plant, not because it needed much, but because we wanted to. She tied the ribbon around one of its stems, loose enough not to harm it, just enough to mark it as ours. When we finally walked toward the square, the morning felt different, lighter somehow, as if the rosemary had taken a piece of the weight we both carried and agreed to keep it. By the time we reached my garden, the sun had warmed the soil enough to release that faint, sweet smell that comes only in the late morning. The rosemary we'd planted stood steady, its leaves catching the light at their tips. But something else had changed. A small patch of green had appeared near its base. It's not rosemary, but a volunteer plant, the kind that springs up without being invited, yet somehow feels meant to be there. She knelt to touch it. "Do you know what this is?" I shook my head. "Wild thyme," she said. "It must have been in the soil already, just waiting." The word waiting caught in my chest. I remembered a day toward the end of the war. We'd been in a half-collapsed farmhouse, the roof gone, the windows shattered. We were there only to rest for an hour before moving on. The floor was covered in rubble and dirt, but near the hearth, in a crack between two stones, a small cluster of green leaves pushed through. Reeves noticed them first. "Smell that," he'd said, crouching low. It was thyme, faint, but alive. We'd crushed a bit between our fingers, just to keep the scent in our hands as we walked. I remember thinking then, if something so small could still grow in a place like that, maybe we could too. Back in my garden now, I crouched beside her. Looked like it decided the rosemary needed company. She smiled. "Or maybe it decided you did." We didn't pull it out, didn't even move it. We just left it where it had chosen to be, letting it share the soil, the light, space. When we stood again, she brushed the dirt from her palms and looked toward the bench in the square. "Shall we?" We walked there together, and when we sat down, the flag above us gave that slow, page-turning sound. It felt less like it was marking time now, and more like it was reading along with us. The rain's conversation. The rain came in steady sheets that morning, the kind that makes the air hum with its own rhythm. The square was empty, the flag above the bench hanging limp and heavy, its colors deepened by the water. I didn't wait there. Instead, I crossed to the cafe, the chime above the door ringing in the warm air as I stepped inside. The smell of cinnamon and wet wool met me immediately. She was already there, caught at the table by the window. Our table now, with her basket tucked under the chair. Thin coat hung over the back, drops of water beating on the sleeves. I thought, "You might not come in this weather," I said, sitting across from her. She smiled faintly. "I've walked through worse." The waitress brought 2 cups without being asked, steam curling upward in soft ribbons. We sat for a while without speaking, letting the rain's percussion fill the pauses. The sound against the glass was steady, but beyond it, the world was blurred and indistinct, just shadows moving in the gray. She looked out at the bench across the square. Do you ever wonder how many people have sat there before us? How many will after? I think about it, I said. I wonder how many came to wait and how many came to forget. She turned back to her cup. And you? Which are you? A question sat between us like another person at the table. I came to wait, I said finally, but not for someone to arrive. More to see if something in me would. She nodded, as though she understood completely. I think I came to put something down. And it turns out I've been picking other things up instead. We watched the rain together, the drops running in crooked paths down the glass. After a moment, she reached into her basket and took out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. She unfolded it to reveal 2 small sprigs of rosemary, both beaded with rainwater. For your garden, she said, so it doesn't get lonely. I took them, the scent rising immediately between us. And for yours. She shook her head. Mine has company already. You saw to that. The rain kept falling, softening the edges of the square, turning the cobblestones dark. We finished our tea slowly, neither of us in any rush to step back into the wet air. When we finally didn't go to the bench. We walked straight toward the gardens, carrying the rosemary as if it were something more than a plant. The rain had eased by the time we reached my garden, but the air still held that fresh, open scent that only comes after the sky has given everything it had to give. Droplets clung to every surface. The rosemary weed planted days ago shimmered as though it had been polished. We knelt without speaking. The earth was soft from the rain, giving easily under our hands. I pressed one of the new sprigs into the soil beside the first plant. She placed a second just a little further along, where the wild thyme had begun to stretch its leaves. 2 gardens in one, she said, nodding at the way the rosemary and thyme now shared the space. I looked at her hands, steady, patient, the rainwater still beating on her skin. You've done this before, 1,000 times, she replied, but not like this. We stayed crouched there for a while, the scent of rosemary stronger in the damp air, mixing with the faint spice of thyme. Every so often, the wind carried the flag's distant sound from the square, that slow, folding whisper that seemed to say it was keeping watch for us when we stood. She brushed the soil from her palms and gave a small, satisfied nod. They'll be fine. Plants like this know how to live through lean times. I smiled. So do we. She glanced at me then, not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of someone who's been thinking the same thing for a long time. We walked back to the square together, the cobblestones slick under our boots. At the bench, she touched the wood, as always. Before turning toward her own street, I sat down, the rain still dripping in slow rhythms from the eaves nearby, the scent of fresh planted rosemary clinging to my hands. The letter in my pocket felt lighter again, not because it was any smaller, but because some part of it now lived in the soil. What we kept the next morning. The sky was bright but pale, the kind of light that makes colors look softer. The flag above the bench moved in a slow, steady rhythm, its sound carrying across the square like the turning of a thick page. She was already there when I arrived, her basket on the bench beside her. The ribbon was in her hair again, but today it was tied a little looser, the ends brushing against her collar. I brought something, she said as I sat down from the basket. She took a small tin, the lid worn smooth by years of handling. She placed it in my hands without explaining. It was lighter than I expected. When I opened it, I found a neatly folded handkerchief, white once, now softened to cream, with initials embroidered in one corner. The thread had faded, but the work was fine, careful. My father carried that through the war, she said. My mother told me he kept it in his breast pocket. I've had it ever since. I traced the stitching with my thumb. Okay, the letters were almost gone, but I could still feel their shape under my fingertip. Why give it to me? Kay asked. She looked at the square, not at me. 'Cause you've been carrying something of your own for a long time. I thought maybe it was time you carried something that belonged to someone who would have understood. I didn't answer right away. I folded the handkerchief carefully and set it back in the tin. But I didn't close the lid. There's something I've never told anyone, I said finally. When I came home, I brought back a button. Just one. It was from Reeves' coat. I found it after he wasn't there anymore. I've kept it all these years in a small envelope. Don't know why. I can't explain it, except that it feels like letting go of it would be letting go of him. She nodded slowly. Then keep it. But maybe one day you'll put it somewhere that's not just yours. The flag shifted above us, the sound deeper now with the morning breeze. I closed the tin and set it on the bench between us. Maybe one day, I said. We left the bench without deciding to. Our steps just moved that way. The square was still quiet, the cobblestones drying in patches where the sun had found them. The air held the faint scent of fresh bread and the sharper note of rosemary, though we were nowhere near either garden. When we reached the river, she stopped halfway across the bridge, her hands resting lightly on the railing. The water was moving faster than usual, carrying flecks of sunlight in its ripples. There's a place down there, she said, pointing toward a bend where the bank dipped low and the grass grew thick. When I was a girl, I'd go there too. Hide things I didn't want my brothers to find. Letters, ribbons, little pieces of glass I thought were treasure. It's quiet there. It keeps things. I looked at the spot. From here, it seemed nothing more than a patch of shadow and green, but the way she spoke of it made it feel different, like a drawer in the earth, closed but not locked. You're thinking I should put the button there, I said. Maybe, she replied, or the letter, or both, not to lose them, to let them be found when the time is right. The idea settled in me the way a stone sinks in still water, not fast, not heavy, just certain. I imagined the rosemary in our gardens growing tall, its scent in the air, while somewhere by the river, a small tin or folded paper rested under the soil, holding the weight of what we'd carried for so long. Would you come with me if did I ask? She met my eyes. Yes, but only when you're ready. The river below moved on, carrying the light with it. I leaned on the railing, listening to the sound, and thought about the strange truth that sometimes you don't have to set something down to feel it. Lighten the day the letter chose. The days that followed moved slowly, each one much like the last, but not in the way of sameness that dulls you, more like the way a song repeats, and each time you notice something different in its notes. We tended the gardens. Every morning I checked the rosemary, brushing my fingers over its leaves to release its scent, letting it cling to my hands for hours afterward. The wild thyme was spreading now, creeping around the rosemary's base as though it had always been meant to be there. She told me hers was doing the same, growing stronger, the ribbon we tied still holding, though faded, now from the sun. Sometimes we'd visit each other's gardens, just to see for ourselves, as if the plants might behave differently when viewed from another angle. And all the while, the letter stayed in my pocket, folded around the rosemary sprig, tied with her ribbon. On the fourth morning, I woke with the sense that it was ready, not because I had decided, but because it had. I can't explain it better than that. When I reached the bench, she was already there. The tin her father had carried was in her lap. She didn't ask why. I had brought the letter with me in my hand instead of tucked away. We walked to the bridge without talking. The river was slower today, the surface dark and smooth like a polished stone. She led me down the bank to the bend she'd told me about, the grass taller here. The ground soft underfoot. It was quiet in that way that feels older than you are, as if the air remembers every word and step that's passed through. I knelt and cleared a small space in the earth. The letter fit easily there, the rosemary sprig inside, still holding its color. I placed the button on top, small, worn, unremarkable to anyone else, but heavy enough to keep the letter from lifting in the wind. Before I covered them, I rested my hand over both. They were never just mine, I said. She knelt beside me. Now they're ours, and someday they'll belong to whoever finds them. We pressed the soil back in place, smoothing it as though tucking in a child. When we stood, the river moved on, and so did we, not away from what we left there, but carrying the shape of it with us. It's the weight we didn't bring back. We walked back to the square by the long way, letting the path curve through streets where the shutters were half closed against the afternoon light. Neither of us spoke much, not out of reluctance, but because the silence felt like part of what we'd done. When we reached the bench, it seemed almost new. The wood was the same. The flag above it moved with its familiar low whisper, but something in the air around it felt changed, as if the bench itself knew we weren't carrying quite as much anymore. We sat, the wicker basket beside her, my hands resting on my knees. It feels different, she said after a while. It does, I agreed, like we brought less back with us. A boy passed through the square, chasing a ball that rolled close to our feet. He stopped, picked it up, and smiled in that quick, shy way children do before running off again. His laughter trailed behind him, light and untroubled. I realized then that I hadn't thought about the letter or the button since we left them by the river. Not with longing, not with regret, only with a quiet satisfaction. It's like knowing a task is complete and no longer needs tending. She took something from her basket, to small rolls wrapped in paper, and handed one to me. For here, not for later, she said. We ate without hurry, the bread soft, the crust warm from the sun. Around us, the square was alive in its own small ways. A woman shaking out a tablecloth from a balcony. The chime of the cafe door, the faint scent of coffee drifting across the stones. After we finished, she brushed the crumbs from her hands and looked toward the river's direction. It will keep them well, she said. I know, I replied. The flag shifted overhead, making that slow, page-turning sound. And for the first time in years, I felt ready for whatever the next page might hold. The morning that didn't need goodbye. The morning was clear, the air still carrying a trace of coolness before the sun took full hold. The flag above the bench moved in slow, unhurried arcs, the sound deep and even. She was already there when I arrived, the ribbon in her hair bright against the light. Her basket rested on the bench between us, as if marking a place that belonged to both of us now. We didn't say much at first. We didn't need to. The square was slowly waking, the smell of bread drifting from the bakery, a shopkeeper sweeping the stones in front of his door, the chime of the cafe ringing once and then falling quiet again. After a while, she poured tea into 2 cups. Something's different today, she said, passing one to me. It is, I agreed. I didn't tell her that I decided this would be the last morning I came to the bench every day. Not because I wanted to stop, but because it was time for my days to be a little wider than this single place. The bench had been where I waited, and then where I remembered. Now it could be where I returned when I chose, not where I stayed. She didn't ask why. I smiled to myself, and I didn't tell her. Some things are understood without being spoken. We drank our tea slowly, the warmth of it sitting comfortably between us. The flag shifted overhead, that familiar, page-turning sound folding into the quiet of the morning. When we finished, she opened her basket and handed me a small bundle wrapped in cloth. For your garden, she said. Inside was another rosemary sprig, tied with a fresh piece of blue ribbon. I took it carefully. For yours, I said, and handed her the same cut from my plant that morning. The scent still sharp from where I'd brushed it. We stood then, side by side, looking out over the square. The world was still moving, carts rolling in from the edges of town, voices lifting in easy conversation, and we were part of it. We didn't say goodbye when we left. We just walked in different directions, carrying the same scent on our hands, knowing that the bench, the gardens, and the river would keep what needed keeping, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt entirely like home.